Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Jones. So I'm a associate professor of history here, and so I've worked on the history of energy transitions, looking at how Americans have chosen to adopt fossil fuel energy and the ways that we've rebuilt our lives around the availability of abundant coal, oil, and electricity. And so I think in that the contribution here, and to continue building on what Clark said, is it's not just about tons of coal or gigawatts of electricity, it's about the social formations around them. And so as we get into questions, maybe we'll talk about what we can think about with that in the present and from the past.
Hello, everybody. My name is Hunter Bjork. I am currently the CEO of an energy company locally in Arizona called ESA. We are focused on the commercialization and deployment of clean fusion energy. For those of you that don't know what fusion is, it's what we have in the sky that comes out every day called the sun, which is really primarily based on a mechanism of taking two atoms and fusing them together to produce heat and electricity. So in a nutshell, what we are trying to do is harness that here on Earth to produce clean electricity in a more distributed fashion. And I really loved what the presentation described here earlier about these different ideologies of the future we want to create. And so I'd love to dive into that more as we go through the panel. So happy to be here.
Hi, my name is Lauren Keeler. I'm an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society here at ASU, and I'm also the director of the Just Energy Transition Center. In general, my work is on how people and organizations think about the future and how we can use thinking about the future as a tool to create the kinds of changes that we need and want to see. At the Just Energy Transition Center, we support communities that are experiencing impacts from changes in the energy system. So this began with work on communities impacted by the closure of coal plants. But we are also working with communities that are impacted by the siting of new energy infrastructure. And in the vein of thinking about the future that we want, it's my belief and enthusiasm that bringing more voices into the conversation about the futures that we want is critical for determining the futures that we will end up with and whether or not those futures are just and inclusive. So I'm enthusiastic about processes that bring new and different voices into thinking about the energy transition and thinking about how new energy generation aligns with different kinds of values and cultures and what that means for the future of Arizona.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to join us in this conversation. Lauren, I want to start with you. One of the super exciting things that's going on at the moment is that the state is not leading from behind, as it often does in this state, but rather actively engaging in developing a climate action plan. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity for us here in the state. And you are, in some sense, the architect in the background of that climate action plan. And so I want to just give you the opportunity first to talk about what do you see as the opportunity for the state in putting a climate action plan together. You know, lots of states have built climate action plans, I think in the past, as a symbolic move because we were still trying to figure out whether we were going to act. But now everybody is pretty convinced that we need to act. What's the opportunity to write a climate action plan now to sort of both accelerate progress towards carbon neutrality and make it benefit the people of the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just as Clark mentioned, ASU is assisting the Governor's Office of Resilience in creating the first climate action plan for the state in 17 years. So there is actually a climate action plan for the state of Arizona that was passed in 2006. But this is an opportunity to refamiliarize state agencies and communities throughout the state with climate action and what engaging in greenhouse gas reductions could mean for cities and communities. And I think that's the part that is really exciting to me. As you said, just the act of creating a climate action plan and identifying, well, first of all, inventorying our greenhouse gases as a state in more detail, and then identifying measures that the state is enthusiastic to support and partners who they can work with to implement greenhouse gas reduction measures is itself an awesome accomplishment, and is demonstrative of the fact that Arizona is actually a place where climate action is not just possible, but is something that Arizonans enthusiastically support. So, and I say that it is rooted in solid research conducted by the Center for the Future of Arizona. Their research shows that Arizonans by and large are concerned about things like air quality and climate change, and are enthusiastic about our governments doing something about it. However, I think what's really important in the opportunity that we see is not symbolic action in climate action. And by symbolic action, I mean simply stating big, beautiful targets for emissions reductions, but action that really impacts people's lives. And so I have the pleasure of having conversations with communities across the state, northern Arizona, northeastern Arizona. I'm having a conversation with Yuma County this morning, and we're talking about things that really matter, and that often, I think, in places that are more familiar with climate action, surprise people that are front and center. So some of those things are getting some of the 15,000 residences on the Navajo and Hopi Nation connected to the grid. So that's how many homes on the Navajo and Hopi Nation are not connected to the grid. And so I'm enthusiastic about the opportunity for the climate action plan in Arizona to perhaps support greater grid connectivity in rural communities throughout Arizona, and to be a mechanism for planning how we phase out diesel generators as a primary source of energy in households throughout Arizona. So that is through grid connectivity. It's also through combined battery and solar systems. And another thing that comes up time and time again is improving road quality. Yes, we want electric vehicles driving on those roads, but you increase emissions and you worsen local air quality by having poorly paved or dirt roads in communities. And so improving road infrastructure in rural Arizona is something that a climate action plan at the state level could tackle, and could provide immediate and demonstrable benefit for people's lives. And for me, as somebody who thinks about the future and how we make transformational change on decadal timescales, I really view this as a coalition building. So the state climate action plan certainly needs to engage all of you who I know are super supportive of climate action and enthusiastic about greenhouse gas reductions, but it also needs to be a vehicle to demonstrate that greenhouse gas emissions reductions and climate action is not something to be afraid of. It's not about taking away your rights as an individual, but is actually a vehicle to access resources, federal resources that came from your tax dollars, to do things that can improve your lives. And so that is what we are supporting the state in doing. And it's a tremendous opportunity, and I'm excited to look back 10 years from now and see the way that this climate action plan brought new people into the fold of thinking about climate action as a vehicle for transformation in our state.
Thanks, Lauren. Hunter, I want to turn to you next. I mean, clearly public action is important in getting this done, but you're leading an innovative new company, and that's also a critical part of this clean energy transition, is seeing the private sector create new opportunities, create new directions and really pioneer some of these new technologies that will help us tackle some of these hard pieces of the puzzle. But I was really struck on your website that you like to talk about not only sustainable energy, but also affordable energy and also decentralized energy. And I guess I was surprised that somebody interested in fusion, which I've always taken to be this big giant kind of project, would advocate for decentralized energy as well. So why decentralized? And what does Arizona offer for you that makes decentralized particularly relevant?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I think you touched on this in your presentation really well about, I think we can all agree we want to create a sustainable future in Arizona. That's a given. I think the conversation is more about how do we accelerate that, and then what kind of future are we actually creating? And so when we look at our energy problem, our grid as it stands is a network. It has, just like the internet, intrinsic vulnerabilities, and some of those vulnerabilities can be mitigated through different ideologies of design for a future grid, one of them being decentralization. So one of the big problems we have, especially here in Arizona, is brownouts and blackouts. And so when these events happen, a lot of the reason that you have these larger populated areas being affected by these events is because so much of our infrastructure is centralized around major power resources. So as we go into the future, I believe that a decentralized energy grid, or building another layer on top of current grid infrastructure, is really the best way to help mitigate some of those challenges, where you have essentially nodes of generation throughout that grid infrastructure. So if we're losing energy in one place, we have the ability to replace it elsewhere. So I think solar has amazing capacity for that as well, and ultimately we need a dynamic set of solutions to achieve a future like that. So in a piece of decentralization, Arizona has a very vast landscape. Like Lauren was talking about, rural areas as well. That's another key problem, is moving energy from a large generating resource to these rural communities is difficult to do, and it costs a lot of money to install new transmission lines to handle the throughput to move energy from one place to the other. So the more that we can add microgrids, distributed solutions into these communities, we can start to create that energy independence for those communities, as well as help lower costs, because you don't need to move that energy from one place to the other. A lot of that added cost comes in that transmission infrastructure. So the way that we look at fusion, specifically at ESA, is really how do we build it on a smaller scale? We're not talking about these large, complex machines that are going to replace your nuclear plant. We're talking about containerized micro solutions that are going to be able to be dropped inside of different communities, more in the co-op kind of model that you had talked about, which I see is a highly beneficial model for the future. Total decentralization would be incredible to achieve, but that's more of a political and people problem than it is a technical challenge. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of policy to make that happen. But it's really about that distributed infrastructure, I believe, to help lower costs as well and make energy available at the source of consumption.
Thanks. And Chris, turning to you, I tried to portray this as we can do this, but energy transitions aren't always simple, and they involve a lot of moving parts, especially when we start to think about how they connect out into other parts of the economy and society. Does history give you a sense of hope that we can get this done? And what lessons do you draw from your scholarship to help us think about what we're doing today?
Really good questions. And I mean, in short, yes, I think it does offer hope that we can get it done because, prima facie, we have done it in the past. So the systems that we have did not exist 200 years ago. They were built and constructed by people choosing things with conscious decisions. I think one of the big questions, so absolutely we can do it. Part of the question becomes, how do we think about timescales with this? And what's new and different. So most of our historic energy transitions are better described as energy accretions or energy additions. So they have been groups of people identifying a new source and working to bring those to market without necessarily consciously pushing off other fuels. There have been fights between the fuels in some cases, but often, you know, coal gets added on top of animal power, on top of firewood. Oil gets added on top of coal. Natural gas adds to that as well. And so one way that the present is different from the past is that we not only need to create these renewable energies, we need to actually think about taking other things off in ways that we haven't consciously done. But I think, you know, and I think one of the other lessons from energy history is they do take a while to fully scale up, that these are decades-long transitions. But I would note, and here's where I think, you know, there's a really interesting focus on Arizona here, and I'm just thinking about what makes Arizona so distinct, right? I mean, we don't have many oil or natural gas resources here. We do have a lot of sun. There's more nuclear than some places. We also, you know, the Navajo Reservation and its electrification, I don't know if my numbers are still right, but this was a few years ago. I think 2/3 of Americans who do not have access to electricity in their homes live in Arizona. I mean, that's crazy that there's something like the last number I saw, and it's a little old, was like 30,000 Americans without access to electricity and 20,000 of them in Arizona. So we're in this very interesting state. But I think when we start thinking about things at the state level, we can imagine change happening faster. When you're sort of imagining what's a national transition, that does take a long time because so many things happen in different places. But some of the stuff I did in the past was to do a similar regional analysis. The sort of roots of American fossil fuel consumption happened on the East Coast, largely in the sort of industrial mid-Atlantic, states like Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. And what you saw there was actually some energy transitions happening much faster than the nation as a whole. And so I think what you said with EV adoption rates hitting 5 to 10%, there's definitely some historical analogies where it actually turned out the first major use of coal was for home heating and replacing firewood that way. And it was slow to get to that first 5 to 10% and then accelerated significantly afterwards. And it happened rapidly in that particular context. And so I think we might expect to see some of that change happen more quickly, and that the past provides good evidence of that. The final thing I'll say on this opening question is, one of the other reasons I see hope in this is when I went back and looked at the first use of coal, oil, and electricity, my modern perspective said, oh yeah, people were going to be totally stoked when they found this stuff and think it's awesome and immediately go to use it. And it actually turns out that was not the case in many places. When people looked at burning coal, they didn't like how a coal fire smelled compared to a wood fire, or how it looked. It was dirtier. It required changes in the technology they had to get for it. That oil, it actually took a long time for oil to be used much in anything other than illumination. And electricity is now something we love. It's amazing. We turn on light switches. We plug in iPhone. All this works great. But for the early adopters of this, running wires through your house that had a force that could electrocute you sounded crazy. It did not sound like a great idea to everyone who did this. And it took a long while for some of those fears and lack of familiarity to be overcome. The reason I share this historical example is the analogy to the present is that I think we're mostly past this now, but some people will say, well, coal and oil are proven. Why should we use solar when it's not? And sort of assume that because these work so well for us now, they are somehow inherently superior to solar or wind energy. And I think the historical example is to suggest that actually at this comparable stage of their development, a lot of people had questions about whether these were actually more reliable or better, and we can use that to solidify our faith that with the right amount of technology and development, we can make renewable energy seem as logical or more so than the others seemed in the past.
Fascinating. Thank you. I didn't know that. That was and it's a very handy little point. I want to push a little bit, Chris and Hunter, between the two of you on this partly on affordability, because I think for a lot of people, affordability of energy is a kind of critical component of not getting lots of slowdown and backlash to the transition. It's clearly been a talking point on in all sorts of different ways over the last 10 years as we've talked about energy transitions. So affordability is a piece of this puzzle. And I want to link that to this question of ownership of energy assets. Because in the past, at least in a particular period of the past, let's say from the 1920s to the 1950s, when we solidified electricity and oil in the American economy, affordability was a question of scale. And so we built these enormous energy industries that centralized ownership of these assets in order to grow to very large scales, in part in order to bring the price of energy down to a level where it could be affordable. And so, especially in the kind of context where we are at the moment, where prices have been increasing across the economy, people are very worried about inflation. Can we think about affordability of energy in the context of this transition in a way that is also consistent with the distribution or decentralization of ownership in the energy sector, trying to address some of the inequality issues that are also front and center in our society at present, and which are, a kind of another grand challenge, which I think many people would like to see tackled simultaneously as a clean energy transition. So how do we think, both historically and with respect to new energy technologies, about this link between affordability on the one hand and kind of the opening up and decentralization of ownership of energy assets in the future?
So when I look at the energy problem right now, and I get these opportunities to talk to a lot of oil and gas majors, utility companies, government bodies, and the conversation is always about how do we become a sustainable energy provider. But when you really start to boil away the conversation of doing the right thing or climate change with these organizations, the thing that it really comes down to is cost. It comes down to the money. And unfortunately, given the inefficiencies with energy sources such as solar, wind, that are intermittent, meaning they're not always on. And like Clark was talking about, even with this EV transition, where charging in the middle of the night when that energy isn't prevalently available, those inefficiencies have led to a situation where really the bottleneck is that we need clean energy to be less expensive than fossil fuels for major conglomerates and big organizations to make a logical transition. So you have a lot of corporate executives sitting in boardrooms today that are looking at the transition saying, we want to do this, but when you lay it all out, it doesn't make a whole lot of financial sense. So really the logical solution to me when I look at this problem is we need sources of energy that are on all the time. They need to be producing energy all through the night. They need to be able to be placed in regions that would be hard to produce energy in. And they need to not be dependent so much on nature to be able to bridge what we call this green premium or this cost gap. Because if you can do that and you can play a little more off of human nature with these larger organizations which control so much infrastructure, they need to have a logical incentive from a financial component really to do the right thing at the end of the day. So when I look to solutions, whether it's hydrogen or fusion or some of these other generator technologies coming out, in a dynamic set of collaboration with solar and wind, we need to really put all those pieces together. It's not a one-size-fits-all problem. We need to really lower that cost by having that access available. Some of that, again, comes down to the decentralization point, is that transmission adds to cost. storage adds to cost. So the more that we can mitigate and get creative around these other cost barriers that are really making it a harder decision for majors to make, the easier it's going to be to accelerate a transition to sustainability. So I really look to cost being the biggest bottleneck rather than a decision to do the right thing, because that's very logical and I think we can all agree on it. So it comes from trying to get that intermittency and efficiency problem fixed, as well as the decentralization component.
I'll reject part of the claim of the question in some ways and take it a different way. Looking historically, large corporations in energy have existed to drive up the price of energy, not down. So a fundamental history of American and, to a large extent, global fossil fuel production has been it's too easy to get this stuff out of the ground and too hard to profit from it. You've heard of John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company. The reason he came to dominate oil was because the whole industry was experiencing what was called ruinous competition. Too many people producing, prices too low, and no one was making enough money from it. He gathered the industry together and exerted control, and basically, by controlling the refining of oil, slowed the amount of oil that reached markets so he could make more money on this. There are all kinds of stories of coal companies being less successful at trying to do this through the late 19th and the early 20th century, and that story of oil continues all the way into fairly recent time and is still there. The whole reason for OPEC to exist is that too much oil has been globally produced for times, and it's an attempt to restrict the supply so that the price goes up. And we've had fluctuations over the last years, but times when they've actually been signaling for cuts. And so I actually think in some ways it's hard to make money in energy because some ways we're doing it really well and the just margins aren't enough for that. And so I think when a lot of these big companies look at it, it's not that it's too expensive to do, it's that if you do it really well at a big scale, there's not always enough money to be made, and that's not a compelling model for them. And so this might, you ask a historian, and I'm like a little more versed before the last 10 or 15 years of the latest dynamics, but I actually think the historical connection between size of energy enterprises and cost does not flow the same way that we would intuitively think about it, or the way a free market economist would think about it. And certainly, if we know anything about energy markets, it's that the free market is a terrible analogy for this. And if we want to bring this up to the present, utilities are fighting tooth and nail against rooftop solar because it cuts into their margins.
Right.
And so I would actually say, if we want to think about size, profitability, and cost, I'm not sure that big enterprises are always our allies. Now, we have to distinguish it, right? You have to have you have to be a certain size company to invest certain amounts in research, potentially, or to be able to deploy at scale. But the incentives do not always line up quite as quickly as one might think. And so maybe in this weird state of Arizona that we live in, there's some way to marry a little libertarianism with a little left-wing thoughts about size of these enterprises and how it might play out.
May I jump in also?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I just want to note a couple of things. So, I'm enthusiastic about the idea that over the last 2 decades, we have transitioned as a society across the United States, but in Arizona, to be much more enthusiastic about climate change and addressing it. I think, though, what we have seen is a merging of climate action with things that that are more broadly cared about. And so one of the things that I think is really important to note from an economics of energy standpoint is over half of the coal units in the United States have closed since 2010. And they haven't closed because we care about climate change so much more than we did, in the 2 decades previous to that. They've closed because coal is not competitive with wind and solar plus battery. But that doesn't address the technical challenge of having that storage last long enough to get us in Arizona through really hot nights, and if we're adding electric vehicles onto the grid, to keep those electric vehicles charging overnight. And so we are seeing a shift in the cost of energy. We are also running up against technical challenges that invite consideration of how social dynamics and policy come to help us change the way that we behave in these technological systems. And that's why I really like Chris's historical reference to people being uncomfortable with the introduction of coal in the homes and not liking it. In our encounters, we're often asked about, what is the role of education in getting people to change their behavior as it relates to how they use energy or how they charge their electric vehicles or choose an electric vehicle over an internal combustion vehicle. And one of my frequent responses is, we were sold on this energy system and we need to sell people on the next one. Right? If you've heard the term cooking with gas as a reference to somebody who's really on fire, right? That is a marketing term that was developed by the gas industry to sell it as a product for cooking. So just as we have been sold on the fossil fuel-based energy system that still persists, so too do we as a society need to really sell a new energy system, and we need to be thinking about it in those terms.
Did you?
Oh, one thing I just wanted to add to Chris's point, I thought is very relevant, is you're right, it's margin for a lot of these organizations that they're looking at. And I think one of the things also here in Arizona specifically that I keep seeing from adoption of solar standpoint is that the utilities are definitely fighting back against solar. For a lot of people that don't know, there's a huge push in America right now to eliminate net metering and to transition to this model where you essentially are going to have this unwarranted cost to the utility. Where that, in terms of, as we look at solar, we really need a lot of push to reform regulations and push back on utilities, because ultimately to have the ability as an Arizona resident to choose solar and have it make financial sense, net metering makes a major difference. So I totally agree with your point. And then also I wanted to add to Warren's point about coal plants, and that we have a lot of coal plants here in terms of volume of energy that are scheduled for shutdown, a lot of which have been shut down already. I think one other thing to help in our transition is that, well, we need to be eliminating and shutting down coal and phasing out of natural gas over time. There also is a great opportunity to augment these systems. For example, with what we do with fusion is it's based on a chemical solution. It's not a new type of machine. And so a lot of these plants have the capacity to be augmented, where you can change the fuel source out for, say, a fusion-based system or a hydrogen-based system, and effectively decarbonize these large pieces of infrastructure to help in the generation of power. And also these communities, as we look to the justice side of this, when we shut down a coal plant in Arizona, the community around that plant gets affected a lot. There's a lot of job loss, there's a lot of energy loss in that community. Yes, we're cleaning up the environment, which is extremely important, but I think a better solution is to really understand, how do we augment these plants and get them back operational to produce energy to meet demand also in Arizona. So I really look to the augmentation more than just taking resources off our grid, which I think is very important.
Thanks, Hunter. Coal communities are near and dear to your heart and work. Lauren, do you want to speak to that issue too?
Sure, yeah. I mean, Hunter's absolutely right. It's really easy as a city to say, we're putting together a climate action plan and we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. But cities generally don't produce their own energy, they buy it from elsewhere. And those preferences for lower carbon energy resources combined with the economics of coal plants means that these plants are closing, and they're often the economic backbone of the communities where they're located. So when the Navajo Generating Station closed in 2019, Navajo Generating Station contributed 40% of the tax revenue for the Navajo Nation and 80% of the tax revenue for the Hopi Nation. And most of the money that is spent from those governments is in the form of direct payments to tribal members, which is then used to purchase food, water, and fuel. And so when coal plants close, communities really suffer. And we're going to see more coal plants closing in the coming decade. And so at the Just Energies Transition Center, we have a number of studies ongoing that look at the repurposing of plants, what is actually in a coal plant, and what can be reused. But ultimately, the communities don't own those plants. They're owned by the companies. And the most valuable part of them usually is the space that is on the transmission lines. And so the utilities are very interested in making sure that they are still generating energy that can go into those transmission lines. But it becomes more difficult to replace employment and tax revenue at the scale of coal plants. And frankly, part of that cost, the taxes that that the utilities pay to the communities where coal plants are located, and the high wages that are paid to the employees are part of why those plants are not cost competitive with solar plants, which will run for a tenth with a tenth of the number of employees.
The ACC recently decided that it was inappropriate for APS to ask its ratepayers to contribute to a financial fund that would support coal communities. How do we convince the cities and the people of the cities of this state that they have an obligation to be part of this solution? You work with cities? I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't have a really good answer, because I do believe that that we should set aside a transition fund for communities where our coal plants are closing, and that it should be incorporated into the cost of transition. How do we convince people of that? I don't know. Frankly, that's not my that's not my area of expertise.
Fair enough.
But I will say that we supported Joseph City in intervening in the latest rate case, and just because they're not passing on an increase in the cost of energy to ratepayers to support a just transition package for communities doesn't mean that there won't be money made available. It just means that it will not come from ratepayers. And so we're actively seeking other means to provide impacted communities with the funds necessary to figure out what their post-coal plant future looks like.
And I think on that, it's obviously easy to look back and say, boy, it would have been great 40 years ago to start setting aside some fund for this. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the next best day is today. And I think if we analogize this, there have been some states and other places that have done this. So Wyoming's had a sort of coal set-aside provision from the beginning. Alaska's oil fund works in a somewhat similar manner, but I think if we're looking forward also to a responsible green transition, it also suggests that we should be thinking in our design about that, about what are we going to set aside from the beginning from a green energy transition. There will be mining costs from the materials, there will be recycling costs, there will be other things that go along. And so rather than ending up in a situation in 30, 40 years where we're like, oh yeah, maybe we should have done something different, it might actually be worth analogizing from some of this to thinking about what we want to put into the new designs.
It's also worth, I think, thinking that about, we've been in a period where renewable energy was expensive. And so adding extra costs made it even harder to reach cost competitive kind of context. And so I was surprised 10 years ago when I went down to Gila Bend for the first time, and they were building all these big solar projects down there, and I asked the town manager, what's your tax revenue plan, right? How are you taxing these solar systems so that the town benefits? And the answer was, well, we don't do that because we want them to bring the solar to us. I had grown up in Wyoming where every car of coal that left the state, people don't remember this, but in the late 70s, Wyoming coal was a clean energy solution. It was precisely the low sulfur coal so that you didn't have acid rain on the East Coast. And so the people of Wyoming benefited tremendously from that, largely because the state put a tax on every car of coal that left the state. And so when I graduated from high school, Wyoming was spending more than any other state per student on K through 12 education except New York, so it was number 2. Arizona is currently number 50, I believe, in per capita expenditures on K through 12. So there's an opportunity here as a big clean energy state to utilize these resources. I want to open it up to questions from the crowd, and as you're thinking about those, I want the panel just to give us a little bit of transition by thinking a little bit about, Arizona's youth. What are the opportunities for young people today who are starting out on their careers to really position themselves to be involved in important ways? I know from talking to my own high schooler, my students in class, there's a lot of frustration with the slow pace of Arizona's clean energy transition. Where are the opportunities for people to get involved that will really make a difference over the next few decades in their careers? Chris, you want to start? As the historian.
As a historian, what I'll say is get excited about being involved, but realize it's a long game, and that I think actually, yes, perhaps there's frustration about being slow, but these are the biggest, as you've said in time, these are the biggest systems we've ever created. They are ocean liners with enormous momentum, but it doesn't mean the effort to shift them doesn't matter and won't continue to do so. So I think go in with a sense that meaningful action can be done and will be done, but with a realistic expectation of a sort of longer process, and maybe gear up for a marathon more than a 5K, might be a thought.
Yeah, I'd say here in Arizona, we are quickly becoming a very large tech hub, and a lot of that is directly tied to a transition. So there are so many amazing opportunities in startups, private companies here in Arizona locally, opportunities for internships. But one other thing I'd hit on too with just talking about policy is education is so important if we're going to achieve a sustainable Arizona. So events like this, being involved, volunteering, trying to get regulators to understand what is the problem, how do we solve this, and what are your actual feelings about where we are today and what kind of future we're going to build. I think sharing those in a more open format is extremely important. And so I think that the education piece is really key to building the future that we want here in Arizona.
So what I tell my kids is I'm not going to change the world, but the world's not going to change unless people like me do what I do. So my advice is, if you look at the report that Clark put up in his previous keynote, you'll see that there's an opportunity to make change almost anywhere. You don't have to work at a green tech company. You don't have to work at the city of Phoenix. Anywhere you go, there's a difference that you can make when it comes to climate action, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so anything that you're involved in, if you're in high school, any conversation that you have with your classmates about climate change is part of the transition. And so don't look for the opportunity. Every moment, every job, every class you have is the opportunity. And so take advantage of it.
Thanks.
All righty,
Questions?
let's give a little round of applause here. That was fantastic. I just want to chime in here, like the energy systems that I think about probably a lot lately is the human energy system. It's like, how are we using our energy? Because we created all these systems, you know, and so oftentimes I call it the red energy, you know, the blood, the muscles, the tissue. And so it's like, how are we using our energy, and are we using that most efficiently? Because we have to transition our energy, you know, as well. And so I've been really thinking about, you know, how do I best utilize my energy? And, you know, sometimes it's volatile. You know, if I don't have a partner come on, or if there's a, you know, somebody that you think would be so excited to get involved, and, you know, they say no, or, you know, they're like, I'm too busy, or whatever the excuse may be. And so that's, you know, kind of reflective of these systems that we're working with, is that we need to transition our own personal energy to align with the changes that need to happen. And so with that, does anybody have any questions? Oh, Jordan coming up.
So I actually came up with a question earlier for the panel that was going to be included originally, but I'll ask it now. There's a question of I think you actually got on this with the cooking with gas. How do you make an energy transition sexy, right? Something that people want to do. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys have ever been coal rolled by a large truck. I'm guessing if you ever have, it's because you're not driving a large truck, right? You're not part of the crowd. It's not cool. How do you make the energy transition sexy so it's not something that people not only want to do, but they really, really want to do? It's something cool.
Just to preface the coal roll, so I'm being from North Dakota in oil and gas area. So if you're in a car and you got a big truck comes up, he's going to hit the gas and his exhaust is going to go right in your window. So that's a coal roll.
Thank you for that. I've actually had that happen to me, and I didn't know it had a name.
Very disrespectful.
So to stay with cars, I actually think cars are probably the best example that we have right now of sexiness in the energy transition. Who you don't ask how to make a transition sexy is a bunch of academics. Okay? No offense, but you ask people that do that for a living, and what you see in the automobile sector is they have seen the writing on the wall with regards to policy and consumer preference, and they're betting that the future is in electric, and that we won't be making new internal combustion vehicles 12 years from now, and so they are selling EVs hard, and you're starting to see electric vehicles that have much broader appeal. So I have a Mustang Mach-E, and my husband, who is like a real car person, drives it all the time, because it's not just that it looks good, it's really fast, and it feels really good when you drive it. And so I say, if you want to make the transition sexy, you bring in people that actually know something about what people think is sexy, and you have them sell it.
So, that's a great answer. I think what we see in the world today is that solar is sexy. There's a tremendous appetite worldwide for going solar. People are super excited about it. We've been doing work for the last 5 years in Puerto Rico among the lowest income communities on the island. Tremendous passion for what solar could do for them in their communities. I think we see huge preferences for solar all over the world. What we don't see, and we've actually written about this in a paper, the title of which is Unleashing the Solar Imagination, right? What we don't see is policies that have explicitly oriented themselves around enabling and empowering people to figure out how to put solar to use in their own lives. And so thinking about what you were saying earlier, Chris, about cost and how to think about it, one of the things that our federal government has done over the last 10 years is it's bought a huge number of solar panels and installed them on people's houses. Now, we don't think about it that way, but that's what the 30% tax credit for solar systems functionally does, is the federal government pays for a third of these solar systems that we put on people's roofs. But if you think about the way that we've done it so that the only people who can take advantage of it are people who then pay for another 2 sets of solar panels to go on their roof alongside. So we've said, yes, you can put solar on your roof, but only if you can afford to buy a bunch of solar in the first instance, and then the feds will add another third onto your system, right? Whereas instead, if the feds had simply bought a bunch of solar panels with the same amount of money and given them out to anybody who came through the door, we would have seen a lot more adoption of, a lot broader, let's say, adoption of solar energy in the process. So I think we need to think creatively about how we approach enabling and empowering people to enter into this. The IRA does a little bit better with EVs by having the credit refundable, by having the credit available directly at the auto dealers when you buy the car, by having the credit available for used cars as well as for new cars. So we've seen a little bit smarter on the EV policies in the IRA, but we could still do a lot better, I think, at unleashing people's willingness and enthusiasm for participating in this transition.
And you didn't say this, and I didn't say this, so I'm going to jump in now and say it. We have to tell better stories about the future. I can't believe it, but Clark has edited 2 books, Cities of Light and Weight of Light, that are collections of science fiction stories about the future of solar energy. And he brought together futurists, social scientists, science fiction writers, artists and engineers to think about what the future of solar could look like and to tell really good new kinds of future stories. And that's the kind of thing that we need. So when you say unleashing the imagination, yeah, we need new and different and better stories about the futures that we want to live in, where the energy system is transformed.
I also just want to lean into being the contrary on the panel. Like, sure, this is good, but we also want this stuff to be dull as crap and like the easy default choice. Like, and I do think, and innovators talk about this, you need beachhead markets. You need it sexy for the first 5 to 10%. But, like one thing we know about solar is that solar clusters in ways that are not explained by any other factor. When someone gets it, neighbors ask, then they learn, and they get more used to it. So that early adoption helps drive other adoption, and it matters. But I also think sometimes some of us in the energy space expect everyone to want to get excited about what we're excited about, right? And most of us just don't have time to do this, right? Talk to your medical friends, and they're like, oh, here's all this health advice. Talk to your foodie friends, and they're like, oh, here's all this food advice. You talk to people, and everyone's got their thing, and we don't have enough time. And so I do have solar on my roof because I'm an energy scholar, and I wanted it there. And so technically I'm an energy entrepreneur, but that doesn't appeal to me. I want my lights to turn on so I can be a good historian, right, and take care of my family. So I just want to add that I think there's something about making things sexy for early markets, but that a lot of this is behind the scenes, and it's figuring out ways to just make it the easiest thing to get out of people's way, instead of expecting that people are going to share our particular passion. And of course, energy is the coolest thing and everyone should love it, but they're not actually going to love it, so let's make it sort of easy and dull too.
I think as one last point is that sustainability is sexy today. If we look a decade ago, the conversation around climate change, clean energy, impact is not the same as it is today. The amount of interest, the people supporting a transition today gives me a lot of hope for building the future that we all want. So I think it already is becoming that. I think one last point is to just build the most compelling future that we can be excited about, something we can look towards and have hope for a better world in the future.
Yeah, hope is tremendously powerful in that sense. Was there a question, one more question back here? I want to hear. So I did this illustration, I asked AI to illustrate an energy transition scenario for the snow and desert. Obviously, it's got some work to do. And so, yeah, just kind of experimenting with what's AI's capabilities. And so I don't think on the right side, we don't want that either, but it's a balance.
Thanks. So we were talking about affordability before in the energy transition, and for me, something I think a lot about is how much money goes to fossil fuel companies through like federal subsidies, and that seems like an important part of forcing the hand of the transition away from fossil fuels, and it also seems really hard to do. So I'm curious on what your thoughts are on how that part of the puzzle fits into the transition.
Yeah. If I can just say one thing, there are no free markets in energy, and all our cost structures are extraordinarily skewed. So fossil fuel prices are skewed by federal subsidies. They're also skewed by the lack of a cost of carbon being factored in. They're skewed by not having effects of health into those actual costs. So there are enormous, our set of ledgers of what the actual costs of fossil fuel energy are versus others are completely inaccurate to what a sort of reasonable social cost would be. Now, if you're going to apply that to renewable energy, you're going to actually find that renewable energy might deserve having some more costs for mining and just transitions and effects on communities in there. But I would say if there's one thing, it's just to never let anyone say that the cost of fossil fuels is what it objectively should be. It's a highly constructed area, and I think one of the powerful ways to potentially look at is to constantly push at the notion that our prices of energy are partially reflected by markets, but by so much more. And that thinking about the policies that structure the energy markets would have a very major effect. And I think it's a really good lever to be working at.
Yeah, I often end talks, especially with folks in Masters of Sustainable Energy type programs, by saying exactly that if you want to figure out how to both accelerate the transition and diversify and spread the benefits of clean energy to a broader array of people, learning what you need in order to be an active player, whether as an intervener or a staff member or an employee of a utility or any number of other potential participants in the rulemaking at the Arizona Corporation Commission on, for example, rules about solar energy is a critical task, and we need more people who understand the power of those rules and ways in which both various places in the world have written those rules as examples, because there's lots of innovative places that have done rule writing that are not the way they're thinking about it down at the commission, but also creative, innovative ways of putting those rules together so that we get the kinds of transitions and the kinds of futures that we will look for. I've recently discovered that there's a second critically important place that if you want to go work and you have talents as an accountant, as a mathematician, and are willing to put your abilities to work, it turns out that utilities have accounting structures within them that distribute the benefits and costs of different things all over the place. And so one of the things, for example, that they do is that they account for the price of electricity generation over here and the cost of building the transmission and distribution infrastructures to move that electricity around over in this other bucket. And so they haven't historically connected those two up. And so that means that they often think that utility scale solar is the least expensive way to go, because when you look at it solely from the question of the price of electricity generation, it's much cheaper. But when you add that you then have to have transmission to move that electricity into your urban area, it turns out when you do those kinds of research, that kind of research, what people are finding is that distributed solar is in many ways not a lot a lot more expensive than utility scale solar when you account for the system level cost. And so thinking about cost structures within electric utilities turns out to be another place where some creative thinkers who could really help understand what that looks like could be really powerful.
And I'll borrow the contrarian hat from Chris for a minute and
My dead body.
and say increasing the price of fossil fuels is a way to suppress its use. But I would caution that that's because the cost ends up getting passed on to consumers, and it's going to end up hurting, if you're not careful in the way that you design the removal of those subsidies, it's going to end up hurting the lowest income individuals first and most. It'll also end up hurting rural communities where there's greater fossil fuel dependency for accessing essential services. And so the transition, and the energy transition is and trying to manage something at this scale is such an incredible challenge, and the word that's coming to my mind is dance, between wanting to rid ourselves of fuel sources that we know are contributing to climate change, and also wanting to create a future that is just and inclusive and enabling of thriving of a variety of different people. And it's not a one-for-one substitute.
Okay, let's give it up for our energy transitions panel. And maybe I'll end with the Permian Basin. They're normally at 3 million barrels per day in production. They're ramping up to 5.4 million, so they're pulling out $232 million a day out of the Permian. So you think of that volume of cash is like that's, you know, kind of what's in the way of a transition. And so we have a lot of work to do. You know, and it's not like the oil and gas industry isn't my adversary. You know, I want to say that. You know, but at the same time, we need them to lead from the front, as opposed to saying, oh, you know, these things ain't real. Because one of the examples I give, like when I'm talking to oil executives, well, carbon's good for the environment. I was like, yeah, we breathe oxygen. You know, plants breathe carbon dioxide, but do you have a garage? And he's like, yeah, I got a garage. So if you went into your garage and you started your car and you had the door down, how long you'd make it in there? You know, and he's like, oh, I wouldn't do that. I'm like, why wouldn't you do that? I'd die. Exactly. You know, and so that's kind of what we're doing with billions of cars on the road, or hundreds of millions of cars on the road, is that we're in this globe, you know, and there's only so much gas that we can absorb. And so we need those fossils compartmentalized and cataloged underground.
You brought up a really good point about what I've been reading in Europe, where they are restructuring cities and where you can have more of either a public or a bicycling, you know, transportation, which reduces the number of cars that are in the congested area. So I don't know any of you, I'm new to Arizona, but are there any plans with our city here to have an infrastructure like that, converting the roads that are in the city here, you know, to bike paths that allow a wider bike path instead of 2 lanes of cars? You have 1 lane of car each way and 1 lane of bikes or other mode of transportation. That would bring the carbon footprint down as well. And so I don't know, is anyone talking about that here, looking at the models of what Europe has done as an adapting and then adapting it here?
Do you want me to answer offline? I mean, do we have time?
Yeah. We got to wrap it up. Can she come? The Netherlands is a great place for that. Den Haag, Amsterdam. Europe is a lot better because obviously density is quite a bit different. But it's still, we have a lot of land, and so we take that for granted. It's like Phoenix, and the area is really huge, and so we do have a green belt, but we could do much, much better. But thank you guys so much again.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.